Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 303 of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel we have Brian Hogan.
Hi everyone.
Dave Kimura.
Hey everybody.
Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. Just a quick shout out about Ruby Remote Conf. CFP is still open, and early bird tickets are still available. At least I think they will be by the time this goes out. We also have a special guest this week, and that is Carlos Chacon.
Hey guys, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, do you want to give us a brief introduction, who you are, tell us about your podcast, stuff like that?
Sure. So ultimately I am first and foremost the first knuckle dragger here on the Ruby Rogues podcast, and so I'm grateful to have that designation. As you mentioned, I do have a podcast. I'm focused on the SQL Server space, which again might be a little strange being here on the open source podcast, but hopefully we'll have some good discussions about why that is. So I'm the managing partner of SQL Data Partners. We're a firm that provides managed services for SQL Server environments. We focus on performance tuning and data availability. So as your applications grow and all of a sudden you decide that you want to make it more available so it can be redundant, things like that, we help organizations with things like that. We have a podcast focused on SQL Server related topics similar to this one, where we bring on guests and chat with them about SQL Server topics, called the SQL Data Partners Podcast. And so I'm excited to be with you guys today.
Hey there, this is Charles Max Wood, and I just wanted to talk to you really briefly about Freelance Remote Conf. I'm putting on a conference for people who want to go freelance or who are freelance, and bringing in some of the experts from the Freelancer Show to talk to you about how to find clients, how to collect money, how to build your business, how to specialize, and much, much more. So if you're thinking about going freelance, or you're already freelance and want to hear from the experts on how to go, become, or grow your freelancing business, then by all means, come check us out at freelanceremoteconf.com.
And so I'm excited to be with you guys today.
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of background, I met Carlos at Podcast Movement, and that's why I knew he had a podcast.
That's right.
So anyway, we've been kind of exchanging emails back and forth, and I was like, you know what? It'd be really interesting to see how all of this interfaces together. It's also kind of funny to me just because over the last week or two, I think I've interviewed like 3 people from Microsoft for various shows. So it's like, oh, another Microsoft show.
There you go. You start stalking you, and that's how they take you over, right?
Yeah.
Which reminds me, I should probably take another sip of my Kool-Aid here before we get.
Yeah, Chuck. I hope this doesn't become a trend.
Oh, this is all near and dear. This is all near and dear to my heart, because the way I got started with Rails back in 2005 was in an environment that was all Windows, and I had to jump through all kinds of hoops to prove that we could use Rails in a Windows environment on using SQL Server as our database. And so this all takes me back because I remember using very early versions of the Microsoft SQL Server adapter for Rails and seeing how it evolved over the years. And it's just this for me, this is very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because in preparation for the show and kind of looking at, number one, how do people actually connect Ruby to SQL Server? There was a lot of angst about that, and that idea, or that the thought that I want to install Rails and get a data repository up quickly was not really. There were several hurdles to get there to connect to SQL Server. Over the tried and true ODBC connection, particularly if you were coming from a Windows environment. Mm-hmm. And so I think we may actually be getting into this a little bit later, but how the free TDS and then tiny TDS kind of came to be, and Ken Collins and his group making that available, so that now I think the connection to SQL Server is much, much easier than it used to be.
Yeah. Yep. For anyone who's ever lived through those early days, setting up a development environment was a day or so worth of work just to and hopefully it would work. Hopefully it would connect.
I'm just going to chime in on that in 2 ways. One is that I remember back in the day I actually interviewed for a job where they used Rails and SQL Server, and I went through JRuby because it had an ODBC driver that I could just plug into the thing, and that was the easiest way for me to set it up. You also mentioned Ken Collins from the Tiny TDS team, and we're actually going to talk to him in a few weeks, so we'll get the down and dirty on how the driver actually works, because I'm really curious to see how that all hangs together.
Yeah, and that's going to be a great interview. I actually talked with him quite at length, again, in preparation for this. Great guy, very knowledgeable, and super entertaining as well.
So I kind of want to do a little bit of intro because, I mean, we all kind of exposed our backgrounds to this in various ways. But, a lot of people look at SQL Server and it's like, okay, so it's MySQL or PostgreSQL, except Microsoft makes it and only runs on Windows. And I know that all of those statements are not entirely true. So
anymore, that's right.
That's right. So give us kind of the pitch on why people should consider SQL Server over one of the open source options.
Right. So, and that was the big conversation, or why would I even consider this? I had to pay for it. It wasn't on Linux. It wasn't open source. All of these things were kind of played in the mix. And ultimately, as I'm sure that you can attest to, and in some of your conversations, we've seen a shift in Microsoft and kind of what they're going after ultimately, and them being able to build up Azure and kind of the platform in the cloud. They recognize that they needed to offer services beyond their own applications, and so they began to embrace different competitors and the open source movement. And so the other thing, at least in the data space, is that from the relational perspective, tables, asset compliance, foreign keys. I mean, this technology is 50 years old at this point, right? I mean, it kind of seems like old hat almost. And what is the new hotness is all in the data science space. And so it was 2015, I remember seeing a report that in the analytics data science arena, MySQL was actually the number one database at the time. And I think specifically because it was open source, you could download it, use it for free. I think a lot of people were just asking questions. They weren't necessarily using it in, large enterprise ways, if you will. And so they didn't want to have to make a big investment into being able to try to answer these questions to see if, hey, this makes sense to move forward. Let's blow this thing up. Let's make it bigger. Have people support it. So in 2016, we have several versions before that. 2012, 2014, 2016. You'll see the release cycles have started to get much closer together. They've started introducing vNext as well. And so with 2016, they introduced several features that focused on this analytics space. And they made a big announcement with Service Pack 1. So there's a little bit of confusion, just to be clear. So when they announced 2016, all these features weren't available. But in the fall of last year, they announced Service Pack 1. And then they basically said, hey, what these were enterprise features, we're going to push these back all the way into the local DB and Express versions.
Oh, wow.
So now you can get enterprise features for free because the Express version is free. Now there's a limit there. Your database can only be 10 gigabytes in size. But again, that idea of I just want to test something, see if it works, right? Start asking some questions. Maybe I have a subset of data, those types of things. Now I have an enterprise database architecture that has lots of great analytics features inside that I can get for free. And so that is kind of the play, or the what I hope you'll find compelling about now considering SQL Server, is that as your database grows, you're going to have better support. You're going to have all of these whiz-bang features that you might not have in some of the other environments.
All right, so let me tee you up an easy one. So
okay.
all I have to do is fire up a Windows machine, and you can just stop me right there and tell me it runs on more than Windows.
So that was the other big announcement, is they introduced SQL Server on Linux. And it is now supported. So that as they, again, it's kind of this V next, they continue to roll out additional versions of Linux that they will support. So currently they support Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Ubuntu, and SUSE Linux, with more supposedly on the way.
And is that just the Express version, or is that their full enterprise as well?
Yeah. So what you'll get there, you get all the versions. What you're getting, however, is just the database. So again, if you're used to seeing it on the Windows version, you might be used to playing with different features. They're not baked in, but they can be installed, or they're included with, if you will, SQL Server, things like the SQL Server integration services, the ETL component, or the SQL Server agent. Those things are not yet ported over to Linux. So all you're getting is the database itself, so the tables, foreign keys, things like that. But then you're also getting all those other features that are in the database, a la, row level security, snapshot, partitioning, compression, in-memory OLTP, all of those types of things are included. And then from an availability perspective, if you're looking at like high availability groups or something like that, that's also supported as well. So lots of neat things that are now available in the lower versions. So that you can do that, analysis that, hey, let me try this out, see what happens. And then as it grows, and you need to go to a different version for sizing or whatever reason, you'll have a better migration path, or at least Microsoft hopes you feel that you have a better migration path there.
So one thing that I'm thinking about with this is that if I already have an application and I've already set it up on PostgreSQL or MySQL, and I'm thinking, well, some of these analytics features look really nice, and it seems reasonably simple to get that set up. Do I just migrate? Do I set up a second database and just store some of the data over there, or set up some kind of connection so that it transfer some of the data over there, or is there a way to use that?
There are 1,000,000,001 different configurations, right, for your data, and we're seeing that even on the relational side. So even the MySQLs and Postgres of the world are answering or having to field questions about, well, what about Mongo, right? What about Elasticsearch? What about some of these other, JSON-based applications or databases that, from a scale perspective, seem to just be a lot easier, right? I don't necessarily care about, if I lose some data, for example, no big deal, right? If I lose some YouTube comments, right, the world might actually be a better place, right? Instead of, from a transactional perspective, I deposit that $100 into my bank. I want my bank to make sure that it sees that, and I don't lose that information. So, again, that's why it will all depend on what it is that you're looking to do with that environment. I think you're going to start to see applications, or even organizations, right? It used to be kind of Oracle and SQL Server, right? Maybe they'd have Postgres or MySQL, right? Some of these relationals. You're going to start to see more and more data repositories there, just in general, because they do different things. They have different focuses. And so, is it worth moving all that data over to SQL Server? Again, it's going to depend on kind of where you are in the project, the goals for the analytics. Again, maybe you keep all that data in the engine that you currently have. You bring over subsets of that, a day's worth, a week's worth, a quarter's worth, whatever that is, and then you can use SQL Server to start attacking some of that data from the analytics perspective, and potentially using the tools that may or may not hook up with your repository that you're currently using, but do have a SQL Server interface. So
that's approaching, that's approaching it from the side of I'm building a product, or I'm building a new thing, and what advantages does it have to me? The other side of things is a situation that I was in where I wanted to use my Ruby stuff. I wanted to use it with the existing database systems they had. I wanted to migrate systems over, and just being able, just having this available, having this database available for exploration, having it available in the limited, the 10 gigabytes database size is limiting for a large enterprise application, but it certainly is enough for the Rails developer to get comfortable with it, to practice with it, to become familiar with that database, just as if they were familiar with an Oracle database or familiar with a Postgres database. Just because it makes the developer more marketable. It makes them able to slide into other situations. They no longer have to be necessarily worried about taking on a contract with an organization that, if they're a freelancer, would they turn down jobs because that organization happened to use Microsoft SQL Server? This gives them the ability to play around with it and see that it's not that difficult, and it works well, and there's some great benefits to doing so.
Sure. And then to play nicely in that organization. So you have to roll in and be like, hey, guys, thanks for all those SQL servers. I'm going to install my MySQL over here. And, you guys have to then support it or whatever.
Yeah. That doesn't really fly well in those kinds of organizations. Trust me. It doesn't work out well to anybody's benefit. You can, if you can, a lot of times what I've experienced, and someone else can chime in too, but a lot of times what I've experienced is that maybe there is a new application, a new internal intranet application, but there's existing data in the SQL Server databases that you want to access, and so you kind of have two routes. One is, well, come up with some kind of replication strategy to export those to a MySQL database, and that's really kind of a hard road to go down. Mainly because of data integrity, and the DBAs who are managing the enterprise databases really aren't that keen on exporting all that data out of those databases.
Yeah, you're giving them another task that they then have to support.
You're giving them another task they have to support. They have to keep it up to date. What if their application doesn't work? What if it doesn't fail? And so one of the things that we had always had success with was we would run like the bulk of the applications on the MySQL databases, but we would have another active record connection. We'd have some of the models actually talking directly to SQL Server views or SQL Server tables, and there are some really nice strategies out there for, Active Record doesn't have to be connected to just one database backend. There are lots of ways to connect to multiples. So it's a great way to kind of extend it, especially again, talking directly to people listening who are consultants. This really is a great thing to explore to help you get into some of those more enterprise areas that are doing things with Rails, because they often have bigger budgets and they often pay their bills on time.
That's always nice.
Yep.
Well, and it's funny, right? So in technology, we always talk about, things changing, and maybe the open source community. So admittedly, right, you're the audience is a slightly different community than what I'm used to, being the knuckle dragging database administrator. But it's funny how much we hate change sometimes, right? So particularly we talk about a new application, right? The new processes. It's like, right? My job is changing. Things are changing. I'm going to be expected to do more or different things. This is going to allow you to make that ecosystem a little more familiar and make that change a little bit easier, that pill a little bit easier to swallow. Yeah,
I will say, though, that I'm sure some of our listeners are sitting here going, I am never, ever, ever going to use SQL Server. But it's funny because I talked to the other day, I've been doing phone calls with people about finding a better job. And you'd be surprised how many people out there are unhappy with their job for one reason or another.
Sure.
But anyway, I had one guy, he worked for a university that's, it's a state-run university. And he basically said, we use SQL Server and Oracle here exclusively. And it's, it's those large enterprise clients, like Brian pointed out, that, they're getting what they really want from these databases. And they have experts in how to run them because Oracle and Microsoft certify people on how to use them. And so...
No, exactly.
And there's before you go on, there's another thing that I want everyone to understand, especially one of the things that was brought up early on is that it's pricey. But in almost every organization I've ever worked in or worked with that happens to have a SQL Server license, they're not paying for it. It's part of a big enterprise license that it's sort of like an add-in for their desktop machines and their server licenses, and so it's such an insignificant price tag compared to what they're paying for their large enterprise support all-in-one Microsoft, where they have an internal MSDN connection, and if you need to spin up a SQL server, you just go and log into the MSDN site and download the license and install it. So they're not on the same level as the open source guy who's like, well, but MySQL is free or Postgres is free. To them, SQL Server is free.
Right.
And that's the state of mind that I wanted to make sure I interjected before you continued. So I want to make sure everyone's on the same page with that. For most of those cases where you're in those environments, especially universities and hospitals and things like that, they're not paying for SQL Server.
And not to mention, when you go to Amazon RDS or Azure, the price is a lot more affordable, so you don't have to pay that bulk license up front. You can just use a hosted instance.
Yeah, in that case, you're essentially paying for bandwidth and storage. And so if you don't have a 10 gigabyte instance, that's fine. You just pay for the 2 gigabytes of data you have in there. And so, yeah, it does becomes a lot more cost effective. But yeah, I was talking to this guy from the university, and we were talking about how do you specialize, and I'm like, look, there are a whole bunch of other organizations who are essentially doing what you're talking about. And so yeah, specialize on the SQL Server stuff. And he's like, do you think there are companies out there that are doing it? And I said, I guarantee it. Because if that's their tool of choice and it's solving their problem and they want to adopt Ruby or Rails in their organization because they see some advantage to it, you bet that they're going to push it onto Oracle or SQL Server or something like that. And so, there are people out there in these large enterprises that are doing exactly what we're talking about.
And I think the ability to be able to find people to support it, that pool is just much, much larger still. Right? So I live in Richmond, Virginia, and Richmond is a big, small city, right? Mm-hmm. And so, finding the expert level talent in the MySQL or Postgres not too many, right? Less than 2 hands probably in the whole city. That are going to give you that, whereas with SQL Server, right, there's more people.
Yep.
And I think just like the open source community. So having podcasts like this, I guess I can't speak. I don't mean to badmouth the other database platforms, right? As I again drink my Kool-Aid here, but the SQL Server community is probably the largest and friendliest of the database communities available, and so that ability to get up to speed or get your questions answered is just easier.
Well, it's quite a bit more cohesive, and Microsoft puts on events that include stuff for SQL Server. So, the training is easy to come by because you just go to one place to get it. But yeah, so I'm curious, just changing gears here a little bit because we've talked about the community, we've talked about some of the capabilities. So let's say that I want to fire up a Rails app and I want to connect it to SQL Server. Is there a good, easy way to set that up? Do I just apt install it on my Ubuntu server or pull down a Docker instance or...
So I'm going to point you, and which we'll make sure we have in the show notes. It's not so. And actually, talking with Ken, he has been working with Microsoft. They flew him out to get questions. They're looking at trying to integrate better in the Ruby community, and so they're actually going to be posting. Or on the website, they're going to have step-by-step instructions on how you can use Ruby and connect to SQL Server. It's not quite up just yet, but I'm expecting it. It will be posted, any day, and that's what I would point people to get started. Admittedly, I'm not a Ruby guy, and so I think for those kinds of questions, I would defer to Ken or the documentation that's there. But that should be coming. The other languages are out there, so the Java, Node.js, PHP, Python, and R are currently there. Ruby will be coming here shortly.
Yep.
Yeah, the support for the support for Microsoft SQL has definitely come a long ways in the past few years. I remember a few years ago, I was writing an application and, I really didn't have many requirements. And I was deciding what environment I wanted the database to be hosted in. I was split between MySQL, Postgres, or Microsoft SQL. And I tried Microsoft SQL out using some of the adapters available, and it just crashed and burned. I had so much trouble. But then about a year ago, I tried it again on a different application where we had an existing Microsoft SQL database, and I need to get data out of there using a Windows service. So I wrote a Ruby Windows service to get the data out of there and then to push it over to another application. And that was much, much more successful. So it's definitely come a long ways in even the recent years. So, if you have been burned by it in the past, check it out again.
It's funny because the place. So we were successfully running Rails applications using SQL Server in 2005 all the way to 2012 when I left, and the people who still work there are continuing to run those same applications now. And the only issue I've ever encountered was where the permissions on the database table would get set incorrectly during a database migration. That was literally the only, and when that happened, the whole thing fell down hard. Seg faults, crashes, everything. It was the weirdest thing. And we eventually tracked it down to permissions and who was the database owner of the database. Once we worked all that out, it was consistent. But we would forget every now and then when staging a new app, and then it would just blow up. We're like, why did we use SQL Server? This is such a horrible choice. Oh, that's right. It's that permissions thing again. Okay, well, we're good. But it is really interesting. I think out of a lot of places that we put it through its paces quite a bit, trying to do the world's worst things with it. With this was before the free TDS stuff was available.
Sure.
And so it was like once we got it set, you didn't touch it. Right. Once you got the driver set and the configuration set, and you got all the ODBC stuff set up, you didn't touch it, and you sort of feared, we have to upgrade the OS on that machine. What's that going to break? But now it's so easy to get your Linux machine talking to an existing Microsoft SQL Server database. There's so many thank yous to Ken and everybody else who's made it so easy to do now compared to the way it was.
It's funny, the way you're talking about this, it reminds me of trying to explain to my kids the days when we had like the old antenna TVs, right? And it's like you move the antenna and then you kind of back away slowly and hope that it,
Yep.
And now we just have a coax cable that runs into the back of the TV and no problems.
Yep.
Sure.
That's exactly what it is. I may have wrapped database connection with tinfoil a couple times.
Yeah.
So, Brian, I have a question for you around your SQL experience in Ruby. And this is just, kind of throwing it out there because, I've used MySQL for several years, but, I've never, ever used stored procedures within MySQL. And I know those are like abundantly common in Microsoft SQL.
Sure,
so did you guys use a lot of stored procedures when you had, access to Active Record?
Yes, we would use it because one of the things that you learn really quickly about Rails is, it's a really bad idea, taking 20,000 records and shipping them off to your Rails application so you can iterate over them in a for loop. When you could just write a stored procedure and iterate over 90,000 or 1 million records in a stored procedure at the database level without shipping it off over the network. So we would do a lot of our transactional things. We do a lot of our reporting things in a stored procedure simply because the volume of data we were working with was a lot of data. I don't like the idea of stored procedures on a programming level because it's weird to have logic in more than one place. But that's easy enough to solve when you just see the value of why are we shipping all these records off when we could just do the calculations, do the logic here, and you reconcile the versioning with just put your stored procedures in your Git repository along with the rest of the code. And have a way to deploy those to your database server when you deploy the application. But there are certain things where it makes sense to just use Active Record. But there are these cases where it just doesn't make sense. So I'm not going to say always store procedures, but I'm also never going to say never store procedures. Look for those cases where it really made sense. We use the heck out of them. I mean, we wouldn't go to the point where we say, oh, no, if we're going to get data from a table, we're going to use a store procedure. That would be ridiculous and silly. We would use a lot of views. Like I would use a lot of views and then make active record treat them as tables. I would do a lot of that. But definitely store procedures. The one thing I wouldn't use were triggers. I refused to use triggers because I didn't like having to explain to people like, hey, you just insert a record into this database. I didn't like having to explain that there's secret stuff going on that you didn't notice. But yes, absolutely. I would use a lot of store procedures.
It's funny. I generally feel the same way about callbacks in active records. So, and it's kind of the same thing. So,
right. Well, and it's interesting, I think. So this is kind of where we're getting into.
Hey everybody, this is Charles Max Wood. I just wanted to talk to you really briefly about JS Remote Conf. We just picked speakers. Things are looking really good, and we're really excited to cover a broad range of topics for JavaScript developers. So if you're looking to learn things about Node.js, about becoming a better developer, about deployment, about mobile development, and much more about JavaScript, then come check us out, jsremoteconf.com. You can also find it by going to devchat.tv/conferences and then picking the conference you want. We have last year's recordings there. We have this year's conference coming up, so make sure you get your ticket, and we'll see you there.
Well, and it's interesting, I think. So this is kind of where we're getting into the two lines, the two camps, right, of the developer and then the data team. And if you have SQL Server and you're, I'll say, lucky enough to work with a team that's kind of responsible for the database, take advantage of that. Yes, that was going to require some communication, right? Some some interaction. I think your suggestion, Brian, or your point where you talked about the database owner changing, right? So yeah, from the database perspective, we were like, oh, best practice, right? Like I want to make sure that it's not a domain user or something like that, right? I'm going to change it to a local account that it won't get locked out, so I won't have problems or whatnot. As a database person, I might not think twice about that. I'm going to need some communication to know that, hey, don't touch that. It's there for this reason. Kind of getting into the storage procedure question, right, is kind of very similar. And I almost kind of liken it almost like to dodgeball. And, so we're all geeks, and we played dodgeball in high school, and we're the last guy, and there's the we're the last man standing, and you have all the jocks, right, that that have the balls, and they're just ready to peg us. Sometimes as a database guy, we feel a little bit like that because we can spin up multiple nodes from the website. But here we are, we're just the one database trying to get all these requests, dodge the balls, if you will, or, get the data back and forth. And sometimes we'll handicap, if you will, the database and not let it use all the tools that are available to it to let us have the best experience. Stored procedures is kind of one example. And again, so Brian said, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. There are some advantages to using the stored procedures. Not having the data move across the wire, is a great example. Another one that I routinely run across is foreign keys, right? So
yeah,
I think for a lot of time developers are gonna be like, oh, foreign keys, they're a pain, right? They make me, I have to think about the order in which I, insert my data and whatnot.
Well, you're going to think about it at some point. You're going to think about it now when you're developing the application, or you're going to think about it later on when you're reconciling why some of your data is still hanging around and others is missing. You're going to do that thinking. It's just a matter of when you do that thinking. Trust me.
Well, and the other issue is that Active Record kind of does its own foreign key magic, and so I see people basically use the magical Active Record name for the field, and then they don't set up foreign keys in their database. And right. I'm hoping you can explain why that actually makes a difference in your database beyond maybe just data integrity.
Sure. So data integrity is a big deal, right? And Brian kind of mentioned like, hey, you can try to put that into the application, but then you're relinquishing the rights the database has to ensure that the data integrity is there. The other component is and I'm trying to think a good example, but you start making some assumptions, and I don't know if there is a default folder, or default location. When I install Rails, I'm going to start making some assumptions about where things are, right? So maybe my library folder, things like that, right? Now, maybe as a good programmer, I'm always going to want to check that assumption before I just plow through and get an error. But because I'm going to be making some assumptions, I'm going to decrease the need to interact with the user, because I'm going to check these things first. I kind of liken that a little bit to the way the foreign keys work, is that because of those relationships and they're intact, because it is possible to create a foreign key and then turn it off. Well, that foreign key is then of no good, is of no use from that perspective. But the database, when it's doing joins and creating that execution plan to bring back the data, it can start making some assumptions, because, hey, you know what? I have this foreign key. I know this relationship. I recognize and understand the data that's in these two tables. Therefore, I can start to do some things that's going to help speed up that process. And that's probably the biggest reason. Again, it's kind of behind the scenes. It's very in the weeds, but also very, very important, particularly when you start talking about your data sets growing larger and larger. So.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. You're basically telling the database, this is how all of the data is structured, and then, it can go ahead and make some assumptions, and, it can load stuff into memory, it can speed stuff up, and it can do all this work. It's similar with indexes in the same way, right? Because you're telling it, I'm going to look things up by this, and so it prepares itself to do all that work ahead of time. Put it in, places where, like memory, where it can access it quickly, and then it just does its thing, and it does it a whole lot faster.
Well, yeah, so important note, SQL Server reads everything from memory.
Okay.
And if it's not in memory, it has to go get it, pull it into memory, and then it will do something with it.
So it does some kind of caching?
Yeah, well, so the cache, so the buffer cache is where it's going to keep that information. So what the index will allow me to do generally is to keep less information about a table. So the hot data, if you will, right? So I have a table that's 10 columns wide, but I'm normally only using 5 of those columns. Instead of having to keep the whole table in memory and available, I can only keep the 5 columns. It reduces the amount of memory that I need to service the most amount of queries. And so that's that idea. I know a lot of times in Active Record has this option, for optimistic locking. And I think that a lot of times developers probably rush a little too quickly to try to push that optimistic locking or turn that on, when they could probably spend a little bit more time thinking about their indexes, what queries get run the most, and again, potentially engaging the data team to say, hey, can you help me out? Let's come up with the best mix of objects and give the best tools to my database so that it can then do what it does best, and then I can only get the data that I need, things like that.
This is the periodic reminder for all developers to, no matter what database system you're using, go and learn about how it manages memory and how it manages queries and how its query cache works. Sure. There's a lot of fun lessons to learn from that, because all the databases sort of do that at some level, and they all kind of do it differently. And they all run queries a little differently too. But if you've got a database, you're going to use for your app, learn how it works and learn how to take advantage of the way that it works. You'll find some wonderful ways to save some time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think to that point, because the creation of indexes beyond the initial, primary keys, things like that, it takes time, it takes effort. some of the tools that are now available in the newest version of 2016 will allow you to more easily identify those queries that are running most frequently. And while there's still a little bit of art to it, it will tell you, hey, I think you should be creating these indexes. And that those analytics are getting much better, and you're going to be able to create the best indexes for that database. Now, there is a downside, right? So too many indexes, you're just going to overwhelm the database. You're creating more copies than you need. And the other thing that I want to make sure I throw out there, again, using my good DBA hat, is that when you create an index, you are also creating a responsibility to take care of that index. It needs care and feeding, and if you neglect it, you're going to see some downsides further on as the data grows and changes and things like that. It's definitely helpful, but it does require some. It needs some help as well.
What kinds of things should we be doing with those indexes? When you say care and feeding, what kinds of things does that mean we should be looking for?
Yeah, so at a minimum, your index maintenance, so rebuilding reindexing, rebuilding or reorganizing those indexes. Now the frequency can change. There are some good. Again, this is probably a little bit more in the weeds, but Ola Hallengren's scripts are kind of a community go-to. The guys over at Minion DB, the Midnight DBAs, they've put together some scripts as well, kind of in that same idea that will go out. You can run on a nightly basis, and it's going to investigate those indexes a little bit and say, okay, based on your fragmentation level, what should I do that will take the least amount of time to provide the most benefit to the index? At a minimum, once a week, you should be going through that. You're going to need to look at your window of when it's going to cause the least amount of resistance or friction. Obviously, if you have data loads or whatnot, you're going to want to avoid that because you can. As those indexes get rebuilt, you are going to cause some locking there. So again, there is some planning that needs to happen, but those are the things. They're built into SQL Server through the maintenance plans that is available. Just be careful, and we actually talked about this on one of our episodes. For whatever reason, the way the GUI presents index rebuilding in the maintenance plan is the least effective way to rebuild those indexes. Because ironically, if you just go in, you just start checking, I want to take care of all my index maintenance stuff, it will duplicate some of the work, and in some cases, negate some of the previous work that was done. So unfortunately, that's one of those things that you ask somebody, right? Do a little Stack Overflow, do a little Googling, take a peek at what the best process is there, but at least think about that and start putting those in place.
Right on.
All right. Well, I want to be mindful of time. I know that there are some time constraints that we need to be aware of. One last thing that I want to go to with this is, how do you actually put it into your Rails app? Is TinyTDS the driver, and does Active Record just know how to use that? Or is that something that we need to dig into with Ken in a few weeks?
Yeah, so Ken's going to give you the best terminology there. The way that he kind of described that to me is that it is, part of those gems, right? Mm-hmm. And so as you're going to get Active Record, right? You're going to need free TDSD, and then you can install TinyTSD, and that's going to give you the connection there to SQL Server. But he'll be able to explain that much more eloquently, right? Once your data, gets bigger and you're having problems with it, then of course that's where I can come in and we can talk all day long about that stuff.
All right.
It is interesting, I guess, so maybe some numbers, kind of going back to that point of, well, who's really going to be using SQL Server? Now, I don't have the numbers for MySQL, but on rubygems.org, looking at those adapters, for SQL Server, there are 1.2 million downloads. For Oracle, I think we were around like 400,000. Again, I don't have the numbers for MySQL. So in my mind, that's a significant number, right? Of 1.2 million downloads of folks trying to use Ruby that are then going to be making those connections to SQL Server.
I'm sure I'm personally responsible for about 100,000 of those downloads. trying to reset up the stupid development machines.
Well, there you go. So you can knocking 10% of that off. We're still at a million downloads. Again, there are people using it. You won't be using it in isolation. I guess I will say again from the SQL community, we don't bite. Reach out to us so that there are lots of those forums. Like most things on the internet, you're going to get lots of different opinions, and unfortunately, it does really depend on your specific environment, on what your needs are as to how you're going to tackle a specific problem. So don't get frustrated if you get some advice that doesn't quite work as well as you were hoping. Again, lots of ways to skin those rabbits, if you will.
Yeah, I would say one of the things that I do miss a lot from the time I spent with SQL Server was I haven't used them in so long. They've changed the name of them, but they used to be way a long time ago called these things called the DTS packages, and we used a lot of them for doing imports. And I know they still exist, but if you have other kinds of databases you have to integrate with, and you need to pull a bunch of data together into a database, the tooling that SQL Server provides, at least on Windows, is incredibly cool. Yes. And there's some great use cases for being able to pull different databases together and treat them as if they were just a single database. And that alone has solved some significant problems for me in the past.
Sure, that DTS functionality that you mentioned is now what we call SQL Server Integration Services.
Yeah, okay.
And those SSIS packages.
Right. I couldn't remember what they were called because I stopped using it in like 2012. They're definitely something worth looking into. That is, there are other tools that can do that, but I've never found any that work as well as the ones inside of SQL Server. We used to use them. I'm not kidding. We used to use them we used to use one SQL Server as a replicant, a way to pass through to migrate data from one other database to another. We just used to drag it through SQL Server because we'd get better results than if we were to like an ad hoc scripting. So
interesting.
It's really powerful stuff that you don't really think about because you think, oh, it's a database and that's just tables and keys. And it's like, no, you got to think about the power, the power that the way its views work, the way that its stored procedures work, or the way the other features work. That you leave, and this is honestly true with a lot of database servers. You leave so much on the table if you don't learn about the database you're using. So I encourage you to no matter what you're using, learn about it. But yeah, if you ever have the need to do some data migrations, it's not a bad place to look. Is the SSIS that SQL Server has.
Now, I guess I will throw a caution, particularly for those who are going to take a peek at the Express edition. I need to double check, but all of the features around that ETL may not be available out of the box. You might have to do some configuration, but they are there, and they're kind of packaged with SQL Server. I mean, from a database perspective, we almost think of them as synonymous, but they are two separate tools. So doing all that ETL and makes it much easier.
Super cool. Well, let's go ahead and get to some picks. Actually, before we do that, Carlos, do you want to just remind people how they can follow you on Twitter or see what you're working on these days? Is the best place to go SQL Data Partners or something else?
Yeah, well, thanks again for having me on the program today. I've really enjoyed it. So catching up with me, SQL Data Partners is the name of my organization. So I've actually put out another site as well. So Zero to SQL. This is something as a site kind of dedicated for those learning the SQL language. Now you can think select star, right? So from that perspective, kind of moving forward, you can contact me there. I am on Twitter at Carlos L. Chacon. And I'd love to chat with you.
Hey there, this is Charles Max Wood, and I just wanted to talk to you really briefly about Freelance Remote Conf. I'm putting on a conference for people who want to go freelance or who are freelance, and bringing in some of the experts from the Freelancer Show to talk to you about how to find clients, how to collect money, how to build your business, how to specialize, and much, much more. So if you're thinking about going freelance or you're already freelance and want to hear from the experts on how to go, become, or grow your freelancing business, then by all means, come check us out at freelanceremoteconf.com.
Carlos Chacon. And I'd love to chat with you.
All right, well, let's go ahead and do some picks. Brian, do you want to start us off with picks?
Sure. I just have one pick this week. It's a iOS application called Launchpad. It's by Novation, and it's a music making application, but it's free and anyone can use it, and it's just clip based. And it's a fun little diversion that comes with a few wonderful sample packs, and it's something that anybody, even if you don't feel you're creative, it's a really neat way to put some music together. But the reason it came front to mind is that my godson, he's just close to 2. His dad was looking for something kind of like that, and I thought, let's just try this, see how it works. And the kid can't put it down. So I guess I could say Launchpad is fun for children of all ages, whether you're a baby or a big kid like me.
All right, Dave, what are your picks?
Well, this week I have more power tools. Yeah. So I just got this framing nailer, like this DeWalt 20-volt thing. This thing is amazing. Like just a power in your hands to like shoot a nail. It's pretty awesome. And then popcorn chicken is my second pick because that's what I ate for lunch today and got it from Costco. It's a pretty awesome Purdue popcorn chicken. And then GitLab is my real one, my real pick. It is a self-hosted, or you can use their online version, but I have a self-hosted GitLab version, and it's been pretty amazing. I love having my own hosted repository that I have control over, and it's written in Ruby on Rails as well. And while we're at it, I'll throw out Jira. I've been using Jira quite a bit lately, and just the whole Altessian product lineup you can get for like $10 per product for a 1 to 10 user license per year. So it's actually really affordable for a small shop, and it's really powerful.
Nice. I'm going to jump in with a few picks here. My first pick is going to be just listening to soundtracks while you're working. I figured out that, I was looking to switch off of listening to podcasts while I work because I figured out I get a whole lot more done when I don't. Yeah, somebody's laughing. Anyway, so I just started Googling for good work soundtracks, and there are a ton out there. There are a ton of them on Spotify. There are a ton of them that I can just tell the Amazon Echo to pick up. And anyway, I super love that. So I'm going to pick that. One other thing is, by the time this goes live, I'm going to have a couple of Kickstarters out there, and I just want to throw those out because I've heard a lot of people talking about various podcasts that have shut down, one of which is Ruby 5. So I've decided that if I can get enough support for it, that I will actually start paying for the research for and then putting together a show like Ruby 5. So there are a couple of things about that. One is I'm doing the Kickstarter. If you want the show, then you need to go support the show on Kickstarter, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. I have to go set up the Kickstarter first, but by the time this goes live, it'll be live. The second thing is I am looking probably for a co-host for that. I'm going to ask the current panel of Ruby Rogues if they are interested in it, but if they're not, then I will also be opening up an audition. And so anyway, keep an eye out for that as well. And finally, I'm really excited about this new tool that I found that I've been using to invite people to the show. It's called 17 Hats. And what it is you can actually set up workflows for various people in various situations. And so all I have to do is add the contact to 17 Hats and then invite them to Ruby Rogue's workflow. And then they get an email that says, hey, look, here are all the details. Here's how you figure out when we're going to record. We'd love to have you on the show. And that seems to work out pretty well. So I'm really excited about that as well. If you're in freelancing at all, it has invoicing options and things like that, which I actually use for my for the podcast sponsorships. And it integrates directly with QuickBooks. So it puts the invoice into QuickBooks, and then when people pay it, it marks it as paid and ties everything up neatly, and that makes my bookkeeper happy. So anyway, that's all really just awesome stuff that I'm using these days for a lot of this stuff. Carlos, what are your picks?
Very good. So before I get to my picks, I do want to say, or I guess second, that idea of supporting the podcast. Now, obviously, the Kickstarter, might not appeal to you, but even giving feedback on the show, what you like about it, what topics you'd like to see, all of those things, super important. It can be a little bit challenging when you throw something out there on the podcast and you don't get much of a response, right? Do people love it? Do they hate it? Right? Talk to the hosts, right? They really like that feedback. And then, of course, if you want to support them with the Kickstarter and some of these other projects that they're working on, they're going to appreciate that as well. And that will help them to continue to put out all this great content. So hopefully our conversation has at least opened the doors to a few more SQL Server installations. And so once you do that and you want to start getting some additional insights into that SQL Server, my partner and I, Steve Stedman, have put together a SQL Server monitoring tool. It's free to the community, to everyone. You can find it at databasehealth.com. So currently it only runs on Windows. So there is that. We'll start looking at a Linux version here shortly. But that is going to give you kind of a graphical way to be able to peek into your environments and start getting some analytics there. Also, just from a baselining perspective, or just to see how things change over time, it will capture that information. So then then if you need to bring in someone from the data team or whatnot, or as your skills continue to evolve, you'll be able to say, oh, I see there was a big change here. Either what did we do? Could we apply something to help combat that, things like that, and get some better insights into your database. The other pick that I have is a YouTube video called "Not the Future" by the guys at Bad Lip Reading, and oh my gosh, it's so funny. This is the kind of the Star Wars parody, and so even though it's not the future. It really happened a long, long time ago. And one of the comments that the guys mentioned is that the first time you're like, okay, that's pretty good. The second time you're like, that's really cool. And then like 500 listens later, you just belt out the chorus, right? You're just singing along because it's super catchy and super funny all at the same time. And so that I want to leave that as my last pick for today.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate you coming, Carlos, and talking to us. And hopefully, some people go check out SQL Server. Maybe it's the tool that does the thing that your current tool doesn't do, and that's what you need.
Sure.
And that's what we're looking for with these shows, is just to, help folks level up and solve problems. And this is something that's out there that I don't think a lot of people reach for first, and maybe people should be considering it.
Right. And I guess I'll make an open invitation as well. Because we have the podcast, and if you think there are topics that you don't see good, I'll say, support for from an introductory perspective, or you'd like an overview in a panel type conversation like this, let me know, right? Contact me and let me know what the topic is, and we'll see if we can't put it together. And I'd be happy to do that for you.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap this one up, and we'll catch you all next week.
All right. See y'all later.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Carlos. That was awesome.
That was awesome.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's always
awesome.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.